questions I did have was about just looking at what's the difference between the music that came out in the 80's and the music that came out in the 90's. And the reason I'm saying that is I'm expecting to showcase a number of artists from the 80's over the next couple of weeks. Um, there are a number of people who are heavy advocates on halftime chat for the 80's and 70's and 60's, and think the 90's was like almost like the worst thing. But from your recollection, as more so if we look back at songs and artists from the 80's, what would you say was the difference when you listen to songs from the 80's, R&B songs from the 80's, compared to them that came out in the 90's?
Difference? I think that music became so much more visually driven in the 90's. It changed our tastes as well. And I think that with the 80's, I mean, I don't know. I really don't see a big difference. I do understand where people are coming from, but I think that's more of age, as far as your personal taste or what you think is a better this and that and the other. I had a conversation with someone in the comment section the other day when there was a thing with the R. Kelly, and he was saying, and we both were going back and forth about R. Kelly and Marvin Gaye. I mean, everybody has their own favorite era. The 80's brought a lot of, I don't know, it was a little bit more fun, I think. I think there was a little bit more experimental.
Yeah.
I think when the 90's came, music, especially urban music, became like very commercialized and mainstream. So I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
it's kind of a vague a question. I do get what you're saying, but for me, being an 80's baby, for me, I just love both decades, and I could take from both decades whatever I needed. But I felt like I do feel like the 80's had little bit more variety, and it was a little bit more experimental.
no, one of the things you'd find from the 80's is that there was the crossover was more. So you'd have Michael McDonald, the Doobie Brothers. You'd have
Right.
a lot of white artists who were singing, Tina Marie, who was singing, and it was accepted within the black community because no one thought now that
Right.
this person's crossing in. Even some of our R&B artists were given a higher profile. They were seemed like bigger stars. So from the Luther and the Patty and Dionne Warwick and things. So you still had the emergence of hip hop with LL Cool J, Kumo. You had hip hop was pretty much very much underground. I mean, LL kind of
Right.
was bubbled up, but it was very much this was our music. So people were afraid of it. White people were afraid of our hip hop, so they were like, no, we pushed that away. Then you had the I wouldn't say New Jack came a little bit later, but you did have the sort of more risque sort of R&B that would bubble up towards the late 80's. That was still almost like this is our music. It didn't get out. Then you had the black artists who could go across to the contemporary art music, like an Anita Baker, who that was celebrated within the white community because it's like, oh, this is really different. It was nice and jazzy, or Sade. So
all those examples you mentioned don't seem different to me with the 90's. I think we had the same thing. We had white artists that sang black music. We had black artists that were celebrated by everyone across the board. We had our pockets of different genres and different things like that. Hip hop had a stronger emergence in the 90's. It came more forefront, but
we're talking about early 90's though, that hip hop became very mainstream. But in the 90's, hip hop was it It was not
Right.
considered, so that there was a massive difference.
Same thing in the 80s. I mean, in the 80s, it was underground, but it wasn't like out there like it was towards the end of the decade. So, I mean, I just feel like it's like, I don't know if the conversation is which one is better. I mean, I don't think either one is better. I think we always think that something was innovative in its time, but everything's been done before. So I feel like the 80s, yeah, I mean, to a certain vantage point, yeah, okay, it seemed like so many white artists were working with black artists. I think there were quite a few white artists working with black artists in the 90s as well. I mean, I get it.
Are you talking apart from Robin Thicke and John B? How many other artists?
I mean, Madonna literally did what, 2 R&B artists? I mean, albums. I mean, Madonna was working with black artists in the 90s. I mean, who
Well,
else?
Madonna's
I mean, we had John B. We had all kinds of artists
all
that
kinds, because you're naming all
yeah,
kinds of.
Pink. I mean, so
Pink had her first
just,
album, and then she went back to her with when LA signed her. Then her second album was very much pop rock.
okay, but we're talking about the fact that it even happened. Like, we can't just dismiss that her first album went triple platinum. That's success with black music. So, I mean, and this was the end of the decade. So what I'm trying to say is, okay, and how many hits? Okay, so we talk about Michael Bolton, we talk about Michael McDonald, but when we really narrow down the hits and the album sales, are they really that much more ginormous than everyone else's? No, I think that in our minds we romanticize certain memories and things of being bigger than they actually were. I think that in general, the music industry, people work together. There's constant stories about people being in each other's studios that people wouldn't have no idea that they were in the studio. And I think that as fans, when you're looking in, oh, Patti LaBelle and Michael McDonald did a song. Okay. I mean, is that really that unusual to someone that, I mean, it might be maybe for the fan, but I mean, Michael McDonald sang black music. He was a part of the Doobie Brothers. That was nothing new. So I don't know. I think that I get what you're saying. There were definitely some things in the 80s that definitely were specific to the 80s, but I don't see one decade doing this over the other or anything. I think music evolves, and I mean, if you gave me more specific, something that was like really like, I will say this, I do think that the era of building superstars, definitely there was a peak in the 80s. And the 90s, we had superstars, but towards, like I said, as the 90s went on and progressed, we started seeing less and less superstars. And there's different reasons for that. But like I said, I will concede to that point. But as far as like musical genres,
Yeah,
and people
but
crossing genres and
even
stuff.
in the 80s, they somebody who sold 200,000 was still considered successful. Somebody who you go gold is like, wow, that's a major
Right.
breakthrough. In the 90s, gold was not, no one. Yeah, you had to go platinum. The standards started to shift when you got to the 90s. We need to go platinum because there was
Right.
probably
And guess what?
was
Just like I
spending.
said, everything is a cycle, and we're back there now where people are glad to sell 200,000 copies. People are happy to sell 400,000 copies. That platinum standard has been lowered now. There are lower criteria for you to hit platinum now. So it's essentially, like I said, nothing's new under the sun. Everybody has their level, their standard of success, and it's going to be changed with every different society or culture's taste.
Yeah, but even in the
But I get what
80s,
you're saying.
there was less emphasis on the look of the artist.
Right.
Compared to the 90s, it was more so on the vocal talent, the ability. Whether you were overweight, whether you were old and stuff, that wasn't looked at. That wasn't a factor in getting a record deal and performing. The 90s became very visual, from the girl groups, how they dressed, what they were singing, even the male artists. There was a very shift in, even towards the late 90s, you could see how the females were portrayed. The 80s were very much, they were almost going around in their dressing gown, not dressing gown, like an evening gown to perform. And
Right.
so
And
so
that's one
that
of the differences I pointed out, that you know, the 90s became more visually driven, whereas the 80s, like I said, when the music video hit, that changed a lot of different things. So it definitely changed um, the public's taste for what they want. People had visual to attach, themselves to, because like I said, anybody could put out anything pretty much in the 80s as long as it was catchy. And I mean, we had Rockwell with some I always feel like somebody's watching you. We had a lot of different, like, gimmicky kind of acts out in the 80s. But I don't know, I get what you're saying, but I don't really see much of a difference. I think that every decade has those type of artists that I mean, we had some artists that probably didn't fit the visual medium or visual standards in the 90s that were successful. We had artists that didn't have the best vocals that were successful in the 90s. I just think that it all boils down to the song and the packaging and how it's marketed, plain and simple. And so yeah, like I said, we all like to romanticize our favorite era that we either grew up or we came of age or whatever, but I don't see any particular um, decade better than the other, in my opinion. But 80s definitely had their moments.
yeah, no, I think for me the what the 80's did show, and I think if you ever get to watch any of the watch ceremonies from the 80's, whether it's the
Hmm.
Grammys or American Music Awards or even the Oscars, well, no, it's not Oscars, American Music or Grammys, or even Soul Train's Soul Train Awards
I've seen a few.
started toward the last, everyone, you know, the even when if you watch the We Are the World
The American
video,
Music Awards and all that,
if
yeah.
you watch the We Are the World video and see how the recording artists, the 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 award ceremonies for the music award ceremonies were very similar to how the Oscars are, very prestigious in how you dress,
Mhm.
the performances. When it got towards the 90's, that sort of shifted towards it lost its prestige, the way they presented. As I said, it became more image driven, and it wasn't because there's a music video, because we saw the artists how they
Right.
dressed in the 80's. It's more sort of the labels and the artists started to try and become more sexualized in how they were selling, and how that became more of the priority compared
But
to.
those ceremonies largely shut out a lot of Black artists, didn't they? At that time, they were so highly prestigious and they dressed a certain way because there was only so many people let in. And we had to fight and break down those barriers to be included in those ceremonies and to be in those categories and different things like that. So yeah, in the beginning, the American Music Awards and all these different things, yeah, they did have this, and the Grammys, they had this more prestigious, more elaborate thing when it was
Even Soul
just more
Train though,
focused
even if
on,
you're talking about Soul Train was
well,
the
because
same
it was
thing.
celebration, because we didn't have it. When we finally actually got our own, yeah, we did it big because we finally got our own show and we're going to show them, hey, we can celebrate
Yeah,
our
but
own artists.
it was still as prestigious in its look and feel compared to how it eventually changed. But as I said, from if I look back at the archives, you could just see you could see the emphasis, because we talked a lot earlier about the songs and the love songs and the love meanings, but when we look at how the artists presented themselves, and how there was the more of the focus on the talent. I dare to wonder if people like
Uh,
Regina Bell and Peebo Bryson, or Jeffrey Osborne, if they would have been given the same opportunity in the 90's, Phyllis Hammond, as they, based on their vocal talents and
and
their skills, if
and see,
they.
that's where I have a problem. I hate this conversation that always comes up in these circles of there was more of an emphasis on vocal talent in the 80s versus the 90s. I hate that because it's not true. And the 80s had just as many mediocre singers and some people that couldn't even sing as the 90s, and vice versa. We had great singers in the 90s as well. I just think that like I said, we like to romanticize these artists like they can do no wrong. Anita Baker, she's a great singer. I love her work, but there are other singers that are just as talented as her. I think that when we start romanticizing the Luthers, and I just feel like it's unhealthy of a way to go, because I feel like it's not true. Like, honestly, we romanticize like the new additions. Were they really that vocally talented? Like, let's be honest. We
No, but
romanticize the Janet Jacksons. Was she really that vocally talented? Let's be honest. You know, I hate to say it like that, but I mean, I'm not trying to down these groups because I love them, but I think that we have got it. The only reason I think that these artists, because their legacy still lives on, they're still in our face. They're still kind of, I guess you want to say, relevant to a certain degree. New Editions solidified their story in a movie, just like Tina Turner. She solidified her story in a movie. Had we not had What's Love Got to Do with It, will we have still thought the way we did about Tina Turner in the 90's and beyond? I don't believe it. I think it's all about marketing and knowing your brand. That's why everybody's scrambling to make their own movie to increase their legacy. If we
well,
did not have What's Love Got to Do with It, we would not be talking
you're talking
about
about
Tina
the
Turner.
song or the film?
No, the movie. I'm talking about the movie that came out in '93.
No,
If we did not have that biopic, we would not be talking about Tina Turner the way we are talking about her today. The New Edition story, that was big for that group. We would not be talking about New Edition the way we were if it was not for that movie. I'm not saying that we would not, revere them and respect them, but I think that these type of tools increase your legacy, increase your worth, and it's clearly revived some of them. They're on tour. I mean,
No,
we can disagree. I agree with you to a degree. I disagree. I just feel like to go into the direction of, there was more of a focus and talent in the '80's. Are you serious?
yeah. Well,
I
apart
could
from
rattle
Paul
off all kinds of people that were not that
Ab-
talented in the '80's.
give me. Apart from Paul Abdul, how many other people are you gonna
But
name?
Nuvo. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on. But again, I don't want to because I don't want to do that, because honestly, I don't like doing that, because who am I to judge the talent? I know my personal taste.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not act like that decade had more talented people than the '90's. I mean, I don't think either or is more talented than the other. I just think that, the songs are the material, the marketing. I mean, was Jodie Watley that? I mean, I like Jodie Watley. I'm a fan. I'm gonna use her because I'm a fan of her. But was she really that great of a singer? I think that sometimes like I said, we like to, because of the success, and it was a different era. And Michael Jackson was massive. I don't think we couldn't even see that today. See something that massive on that scale in this day and age, because of the change of the culture and the society and technology. It's not the same thing. And there was not all these outlets for entertainment. So when someone became big, that was the headline. That was the main person. Right now, Michael Jackson competing with all these different competing forms of entertainment. And we got video games, we got, Spotify, we got all these different things, the internet, online, blah, blah, blah. Could you even achieve that level of success and just complete massive pandemonium and hysteria that Michael Jackson had? And today, no, you couldn't. So I just think that in a way, there are some things that are onto themselves, like Michael Jackson, but to say that, Anita Baker and Luther Vandross were just so much more talented. I know you're not, it's not coming from you. It's just from the, certain people that say this, that they're just so much more talented than other people. They are talented. They are. But I think we have our Luthers and we have our Anita Bakers. We have our Whitneys and all those different people. But,
yeah, I mean, I think people would say that if we can still be calling Luther and Anita and Teddy Pendergrass and we're like, okay, who today has the same sort of,
they're not signed. I literally have been to I have literally been to a concert recently, and it was a local concert, and somebody was singing, and just the voice of an angel. But again, nobody knows them. The industry is not, they're not highlighting these people. The Whitney Houstons, the Anita Bakers, these are not like miraculous occurrences. There are people that can really sing really well. There are people that can produce the hell out of a record. This is not just this one, the lightning only struck one time ever in history. I mean, every decade has their artists. You had Aretha Franklin. People say, "Oh, well, show me another Aretha Franklin." There are other Aretha Franklins, but you don't see it in that way. Styles change,
Yeah,
you
but
know.
what the whole emphasis was really about how the 80's had more. There was very few groups. It was about a lot more individual. There was bands, so we're talking about Earth, Wind, Fire, Time, and the rest of the bands. But individual solo artists, there was the space for them to be developed, and we
Right.
had the legendary singers like Luther, Anita, Jeffrey Osborne, Peebo Bryson, on and on and on and on. They got to the 90's and became okay. We got the groups. We had the R. Kelly, who was unbelievable in all ways. Joe was on his heels, um, but but they didn't have, the industry didn't give them that. As I said, R. Kelly and Joe, they were doing their own thing. But as I said, yeah, music changed. But we got to, um, we still were calling. We'll still, even in the 90's, we'll still say, "Wow, oh, he's not like Luther. Oh, he's not like an Anita." And it's not about one generation. It's still the fact that they were just given space to just release a lot more albums, a lot more singles in the 80's, and really establish themselves. By the time we got to the 90's, it's like two, three singles, great, on to the next album. And so the albums, artists didn't get to really showcase. Cut Close, one album, intro, two albums. They
Right.
didn't have Shy, two major albums, and then they dropped. They were
And
just
I can
moving.
accept that observation. Your observation is more of a change of taste and a change of business. I mean, if certain things are not selling anymore for whatever reasons, of course the industry is going to move into a different direction. So bands are no longer popular in the 90's. So guess what? They're not signing as many bands, and then bands go away.
Mm.
But they don't really go away. They're underground, but they go away as far as on the mainstream. So I think that we have to remember that you're not going to get a Luther Vandross in the 90's. Even Luther Vandross could barely survive in the 90's. Those tastes and styles have changed. Even Luther had to change his style to keep up in the 90's. And I love Luther. I'm a fan of Luther. I'm not dissing him. And people have to understand when I say these things, it's an objective view. I'm not saying it from an emotional way, or I hate this artist. I love every artist I mentioned, but I
Mm.
have to be honest. And there was no place for Luther Vandross in the 90's. There was no place for Anita Baker. I mean, Anita Baker released some songs in the 90's, and they did okay, but not what her heyday what her did.
No,
So
but she
even
still.
Anita couldn't.
I
Okay, go.
apologize. That album
That
went.
wasn't a big hit. It was okay. It was
It
okay. We're talking about Anita's albums were selling close to 7-8 million copies in the 80's, and then when she came out in the 90's, her album went double platinum or triple platinum. That's not the same thing. And I told somebody this before because they was like, "Oh, how was it a flop? If your first album sells 10 million copies and your next album goes double platinum, that's a flop by the industry standards, because they have, if anything, they spent more money on that second album because they got better producers, they spent more money on the imagery, they probably spent more money. The budget goes up, it doesn't go down. So
Yeah, but
that's
in the
considered a
90's, this
flop.
was probably her fourth album or fifth album. Um,
I'm not saying it wasn't successful, it just
yeah,
wasn't what she's used to.
yeah,
But I mean,
yeah, but anyway, yeah, but as I
and she
said,
didn't write that song. That's another thing. She didn't even write that song. I believe Gordon Chambers wrote it. So I mean, she in the 80's she was writing her own material. So that was already a showing of needing something to freshen up her material, because she was trying to adapt to a time period that was changing. So like I said, I have high respect for these artists, but I don't put anybody on the untouchable pedestal like no one. I just don't do that, because there's a lot of artists that I have seen that are so talented and no one knows who they are. And granted, that doesn't, just because you're talented, it doesn't guarantee that you would have had hits. I know, but I think that a lot of times people think of, oh, but Anita's voice, they romanticize that. Luther, the way he sang, I've heard people sing as good as those people since then. But that's just me.
Yeah,
I'm,
yes,
I know that's controversial, but
but
again,
yeah,
like I said, there was no place for those type of singers in the 90s. We had our own versions of that in the 90s. Um, Toni Braxton was kind of, I won't say, I'm not saying she's Anita Baker, but the way she came in and she just kind of automatically just came off selling 8 million copies, 10 million copies. That we had our own success stories of artists with, I would say I wouldn't say Anita's fan base would necessarily be the same fan base, because I think that Toni went for a younger audience. And I think that the good thing about Anita is she appealed to jazz enthusiasts, R&B fans, pop people. She was across the board.
hmm
So I give her her props. But again, like I said, it's so many different layers into that about who's controlling what and what artists and etc. What they're allowing artists to do. But I get what you're saying. I do get it, but I don't think that the 80's were more of a. I feel like they were more experimental in a way. There were, like you said, a good observation is that there were a lot of collaborations, rock and pop. But I do think that in the 90's was pretty similar and on par with the 80's. It was a different time period. It was just a different thing. Same thing, just different faces, new people.
yeah. Well, I think with all things, it's always going to be for those who are watching and listening, for them to
I
I
know
always
somebody
hope that.
saying, what about Prince? What about Michael Jackson?
Well, as I said, the 80's gave the opportunity for them to
Right.
establish the labels made more money in the 90's than ever, and as they were making more money, they started shifting to maximize their profits. As I said, Guy's future album, they released I think 6 or 7 singles off a 15 song album. They weren't doing that in the 90's. Um, but anyway, it's I remember I when Michael released Thriller, they had to only have 8 tracks. I mean, so you can see how the albums were. The albums were 8, 10 album songs, and they it was very meticulous as to what could go on there. In the 90's, Blackstreet had 15, 17 songs in an album. It was like just stuff as many in, bring
Right.
interludes. It
And
almost,
that's
I wouldn't say the quality went down, but it was very much of a, we've got a CD now, we can put more stuff on there, and it
right.
doesn't
And
matter
that's
what's
why,
on there.
and that's another reason in closing, that's for me anyway. That's why it's of unfair comparison, because of the tools and resources that each um decade or generation, whatever you want to call it, they have. And like I said, when people say, well, what about Michael Jackson? Before Michael Jackson, it was James Brown. Like there, he didn't have the same platform that a Michael Jackson had. And these artists that we put on this pedestal, the Luthers, the Anita Bakers, the Princes, they were influenced by someone too. They were influenced by a lot of people as well. And we never talk about the Jackie Wilsons. We never talk about the Nat King Coles. These people, every era has their standout signature artists that people love, and they can do no wrong. And that's why I don't like to get in those conversations, because we all have our own personal faves. And it's hard to, those metrics that we're trying to say, oh, but this person sold this and this. Like there's one thing that came out where it said Beyonce has been more successful than Michael Jackson. I mean, I it's frustrating, because when you really crunch down the numbers and the data, it doesn't make sense. But there's no way. But again, it's a different generation. Let them have their time. That's how I feel. I don't want to argue back and forth with people about who's better and whatever. The 80's was a great decade. I wish I was an adult in the 80's. I would have loved to, it just seems like a fun time. I know they had his dark periods too, but I would have loved to have been an adult. Um, The 90s, I love the 90s. But again, I don't. I'm not one of those people that, oh, the 90s were so much better. I'm not. Um, you know. But I get
Yeah,
what you're saying. I respect it. I respect it.
yeah.